Is this, is the thing working? Time. Okay, we can start anyway till they get it started. Sports law the entire layout is based on a pyramid. So this is how regulatory bodies work in sports. And sports is unique from everything else you will see in any organizational structure because it works in a pyramid of organized bodies. So at the very top of the pyramid, and you'll hopefully they can get it working and we can see the next slide. It is, at the top of it is what's called the International Olympic Committee. It's the IOC. The IOC is kind of the parent body for the entire world on all Olympic sports. The IOC is actually comprised of two kinds of organizations. One is what they call IFs, which are the international federations. So there are two sets, the international federations, and then they have the NOCs, which are the local committees. So you have in India, we have, okay, great. We have what is known as the IOA. Okay, the formatting of this pyramid's gone a bit off. But basically, if you see at the top of it, there is the IOC. The NOC, like India has the IOA. It is called the Indian Olympic Association. They have to be affiliated to the IOC, which is based in Switzerland, to actually participate in the Olympic Games, the Asian Games, the Commonwealth Games. If you are not a member of the IOC as a country, through your local Olympic organization, you cannot participate. So athletes can't participate. So it's a very important gateway. The IOC also has a second set of members, which are the international federations. So the one you're probably most familiar with as an international federation, which has only recently joined the IOC, is ICC, the cricket organization. But there's FIFA, there's FIH, which is for hockey, there's the Athletics Federation. So each international federation has members from each country unit. So the IOC has two sets, which are the national Olympic organizations and the international federations. They all come in together to form the IOC. They have elections, they have a governing body, and that's how they conduct sports worldwide. When you go one step down, you have what is known as national sports federations. So each international sports federation then goes one step down to have national sports federations as its members. So for instance, FIFA will have the AIFF, which is the Indian sports body, as its member. And so I've given in the resource materials what I've given you, and it looks very dense, but it's actually just the baseline documents. And you don't need to read all of it, but it's something to look back to if you're ever interested in this. There's the Olympic Charter, because that has the framework for the whole world. There are two international charters, one for FIFA and one for hockey. And then we've put the Indian charters for that, which is for the AIFF, which is the football organization, and for Hockey India. So you have the rules and regulations basically from NSFs, IFs, NOC. I've given the IOA charter as well, and then up to the IOC. So that's the entire sort of flow of how these memberships work. Now, if you see below that, what does a local national sports federation, what are they supposed to do? So they are actually supposed to govern the sport in their country. And they have to maintain their recognition to the international federation. So we'll just come to that in the next slide, because then it'll explain to you what the regulatory framework is in India. So in India, it's even more complicated, because apart from the Olympic Charter, which governs everybody, India has its own set of administrative circulars that have kind of been pulled together in a fairly haphazard way, and they call it the National Sports Code. And there's been a lot of litigation about that. We've been in a lot of those cases, so I'll explain it to you on how it works. But basically, what you'll see over here is the district sports, state sports, national sports. So even at the district level, if any of you have played districts or zonals, you have to play it in that pyramid. So there will be selectors for the state teams at the district level. They'll then scout, they'll look. You can then go to state tryouts. It all goes up and feeds finally into national camps, which they attend all the state championships, national selectors will go, and then it goes further up to, do you represent your country or not? And then competing at the international level. So this is how it works if you see over here, what are the various layers of memberships you need to have as per these charters and regulations. So you have over here, you have to be affiliated to the IOC. Two people have to be affiliated. The International Federation has to be a member for that sport to be included in the Olympics and Asian Games, Commonwealth Games, etc. And you have to be affiliated as the local, let's say the Indian Olympic Association, to the IOC as well. That means you have to actually be regulated as per their charters. If you violate their charters, they can suspend you, means they suspend your country. And then we see that so for a NSF, that's the short form for what we call the National Sports Federations in India, you have to be recognized by the IOA. You have to have membership of the IOA, otherwise you're out. You have to have membership of your International Sports Federation. And the government has added yet another layer where you have to be affiliated under the National Sports Code. You have to have recognition from the Indian government. Then you are in a position to govern that sport in India. And because they did make a sports bill, it never passed Parliament. So today it's regulated in this haphazard National Sports Code, which is in the resource materials, and you'll find it fairly unreadable as a student because it's literally a collection of circulars. And we can just go straight to that, which is, so there's a collection of administrative circulars. And the court, so there was a lot of push and pull between sports federations and the government. Sports federations, of course, wanted to maintain their independence. The government wanted more control, more transparency, wanted to hold them accountable for, one, how they use money, but also their activities. It's also because sports is something that brings sort of national pride. Governments like to be involved. But at the same time, the Olympic Charter says you will not have any government interference in any sports body. So what has happened in many countries, in fact, Kuwait got suspended from the Olympic Games for this. India did too at one point of time in 2012, and I'll come to the suspensions. But basically, the Olympic Charter mandates that you must be an autonomous body. You must be independent of any political interference, and you must be independent of your government. The sports code actually says otherwise. It says that, look, it doesn't require you to have any kind of government person on the body, but there is a certain level of transparency it asks of you. You're audited by the CAG, you have to give the Comptroller General of India, you have to give certain reports to them, you have to share your calendar, all those kind of things. So really what happens with the way the push and pull between the sports code and resulted in a number of cases, and I'm going to come to them, but the two really big changes that the sports code brought about was that there's a 12-year maximum tenure for any president or secretary general in a sports body. Reason being that, and this is a worldwide problem, I think Sepp Blatter was like in FIFA for, I think, 17 years or something. So people had fiefdoms internationally, nationally. It was a perpetuating kind of thing. So what they did was they said 12 years, but you have to break it in the 8-year cap and have a cool-off period. And then you can come back for your last tenure. So what they were trying to do is make it more inclusive, prevent one person from sort of ruling the roost for too long. 8 years is still quite long. And then they made an age limit of 70 years. That 70-year age limit actually comes from the Olympic Charter. So they introduced an age limit. So age and tenure limits, when they introduced them, the sports bodies didn't like this. So a huge amount of litigation has come out of sports bodies and the government at loggerheads on whether the sports code is binding or not. And so these are three cases that have come out of this. These are sort of three landmark cases. The first one is in 2009. And in this case, it was the first case where it was tested, and it was held by the court that it is binding, everybody needs to comply. Sports bodies still continued to push and pull, saying, I'm a private body, I am going to flout this, what are you going to do about it? And one of the biggest things that sort of soared over everybody's head is they will say that the International Federation may not recognize us anymore because I have to be autonomous. So, government, should you be doing this? Should you be getting involved? Because you also need to be mindful of the international charters. So, the second one is a case called Aslam Sher Khan, and that was with regard to hockey, where Aslam Sher Khan was a former hockey player, And he said that, look, you should not, the sports code says, does not mention a life president. There's a life president who's been there for many, many years. That should be banned. The sports code actually didn't say anything about that, interestingly enough. It didn't mention whether there is a life president or not. But the court went out to hold that, look, in general, the import is to not have perpetuating legacies. Therefore, we will decide that you're not going to have a life president. Life presidents are actually illegal. Once somebody's term is over, they cannot be part of this organization. Also, that was tested in this was the role of a CEO, because CEOs are new to these sports federations. If you look back 20 years, there were no sports federations who had a person in the role of CEO. Now it's actually provided for. And so the court said, we don't see there's anything wrong with having a CEO, but that CEO should not have any voting rights on your executive board, because that person is not an elected person. So they kind of circumscribed what the roles could be within the framework of the National Sports Code. And that's one of the things about litigation, sports litigation in India. Courts have opinions on this. A lot of it is based on what they've read about sports, sometimes seeing poor management of sports, an incident that happens, let's say, during the CWG hosted in India. So it's one of the things we sort of find challenging, or it sometimes can work in your favor in a courtroom. But what is challenging is there is always, the courts may go a little bit ahead or outside of what's written in the sports code. So what's in the sports code is one gamut of rules, and then if you were to actually compare the sports code to these cases, you'll find they've gone a little plus on what the sports code actually says. And the last one is a very recent one, Rahul Mehra versus Union of India. Rahul Mehra is a lawyer who is a PIL petitioner and filed a series of cases on sports, being a sports enthusiast. And what came about after many years, this was, I think, a 2010 case that finally got decided in 2022. So there were maybe 80 hearings. But at the end of it all, where we landed up was they said the sports code is binding, but they also interpreted each provision of the sports code and told all the national sports federations and the Olympic Association that you have to redo your constitutions in a way that we now prescribe. And they actually prescribe it in this judgment. This went up to Supreme Court. Supreme Court partially modified it, but it was such a complicated process that they actually appointed a retired Supreme Court judge to hold a hearing in Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium, where all the sports federations were heard in this 3-day period. And he then, after having a public hearing, and anyone could go, after having a public hearing, he then gave the framework for how the sports code, the constitutions of all the federations need to be changed. And so it is a fairly interesting process. So now the case is still going on in Supreme Court, but in Supreme Court has already mandated everybody make those changes. So there have been interesting kinds of developments on this. Now, one of the things is, how does this entire structure benefit athletes? Is it good for athletes? Is it bad for athletes? One of the biggest things here is that what happens, and Diya is going to go further into this, there is a sporting calendar, and the sporting calendar actually has to work for the world, because you can't be having, let's say you shouldn't be having IPL when a World Cup is on. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for anybody. So even with private leagues or even different countries hosting conflicting tournaments, let's say the Asian Games and the Olympic Games are clashing, that really can't happen. It shouldn't happen. So there is the reason for one country, one organization, one sport, to bring it into this pyramid. One of the reasons why they justify, and Diya's again going to go into this, but is that there are events, there's a sporting calendar for the entire world. So athletes are able to go into deciding where they're going to compete, where they're not, and also which is the pyramid that they want to be a part of, that they are being recognized. So let's say there were 3 sets of district events being held in Delhi for football. the people who need to participate, they want to know where are the state selectors going to come. I want to be in that one. If they don't know who the organizer is and whether that organizer, let's say Delhi football, is associated with the national federation, they don't know which one of these three is the legitimate one and to participate in that. So there has to be a certain level of certainty for athletes, which is one of the good things. The other is that all the anti-doping stuff is actually governed through these structures. So, in fact, Russia had a fairly rocky relationship with the IOC on doping when a lot of stuff got exposed. But what happens is that you have to be compliant as a nation, you have to have these bodies in place, and each of your bodies has to be enforcing what the rules are. So whether it's drug testing, whether the labs are legit or not, all of that, that entire body of anti-doping rules has to be considered and taken into account. And that benefits athletes because they don't want a situation where if your country is lax, you go to the international level, you're going to land up getting into trouble and probably disqualified. We then have the national sports federations also work with the government. So what the government provides, and this is interesting in the Indian context, so what does the Indian government really give sport? So all the Sports Authority of India, I don't know if any of you have been to the facilities that SAI has, but they have really big, beautiful facilities. Those are given to national camps for training. The coaches are actually paid by the government. So when the national team is training, coaches are given a salary. Now, BCCI there's a separate slide on BCCI, I'll come to that. They're an outlier in all of this. They have their own money and muscle to do it. So this is for all the other Olympic sports that are there till now. Of course, now that's changed a bit. And the other is an interesting case we did very recently where on protecting athletes from people within the system, stakeholders. So the women's hockey coach actually had published a book. He published a book. He was the captain of the men's and women's hockey team. And they found out, and they somehow got an advance copy before its launch, that he has divulged huge details about even medical conditions of players, how they play, what their weaknesses are, all kinds of analysis of the game for when he was there. On the men's side, he went a little beyond that and started talking about, oh, so-and-so was womanizing and in somebody's room with such and such players, and huge personal details. We filed a case against HarperCollins. There were two of them. One was Manpreet Singh, the other was Gurjeet Kaur. Manpreet Singh's actually, those allegations got printed in the Indian Express before it was even released. So the coach was in very hot water because there is, and so the court held here that there's a fiduciary relationship between the coach and the players. And he made some allegations about Manpreet Singh, which were completely false, which Manpreet Singh could prove were false. And when the coach was asked by the court that, do you have a defense to this? He said, oh, I actually just heard it from a third person. It was gossip. And the judge said, this is indefensible, what are you going to do? So they actually pulped the book. HarperCollins destroyed the book, never released it. He apologized for the statement made to the Indian Express, said, I retract it, very, very sorry. I actually heard it from somebody else. It was hearsay, and I don't even know whether it was true or not, and I understand it's not true. But one of the interesting things, and in this set of cases, was that courts had we couldn't find a judgment or precedent on the fiduciary relationship of a coach to its players in India. And part of this case actually went on contract then, because the coach had a code of conduct with Hockey India, which had a confidentiality clause. So these are one of the things to keep in mind if you're ever representing any of these people, is that the law is so nascent on this that when you're talking about, we did have to rely on the contract despite the fact there's a fiduciary relationship with the coach. And how far that fiduciary relationship goes to protecting the reputation of a player, the secrets of a player, the mental health of a player, all these things which are in public domain. One is, and this was one of the things that Gurjeet Kaur said, she said, if every weakness of a player is published, every team we play is going to know how we operate, which side to tackle who from, who has a stronger right side, left side. She's like, this is insane. And it was. So it was a very interesting case, but it's also about sometimes when you're bringing stakeholders into the system, like a coach, like a sponsor, anybody, it's for the federation to make sure that the players rights, their image rights, their personality rights, the right to their own photographs, the IP, everything, and everything, their physical being is protected by the organization because they need that. They're in the hands of many people. And that happened with gymnastics in the US, where there was a doctor who sexually assaulted many of the athletes. And despite receiving complaints, the Sports Federation didn't do anything about it. And there were consequences that finally followed, but it was one of the big lapses that happened in non-protection of players. So now suspensions. What happens when you violate all these codes of conduct, the rules, the Olympic Charter? Now, and something interesting, which is that politics supposed to be out of sport. You're supposed to be completely free of it. It says no political interference in this. But Russia has been banned after its invasion of Ukraine. Its suspension actually says so. It says that because they have violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. There was a recent call, and okay, this is another interesting point, which is that if you are not happy with the decision of the IOC, so the IOC is all powerful, and they say that, look, we're banning Russia, or they say that, look, we have suspended the Indian IOA, which they have done in the past. Where do you go from there as a national committee? Or where do you go as an international federation? Because who governs this? So their statutes have a court of arbitration of sport, which is in Lausanne, and the appeal from there actually goes to the Swiss Federal Court. So they are governed by Swiss law, in essence, and whoever wants to challenge that will have to go to Switzerland. So in India, there was a fight between two hockey federations of who is going to be the recognized hockey federation. They first litigated it for like 7 years in India. After that, because the International Federation had recognized one body rather than the other, the International Federation couldn't be brought into courts in India. So it reached a standstill where the courts in India said, look, we can't examine whether this association who's under Swiss law is actually, has done the right thing. So the one hockey federation actually went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and sought a decision from them. And then they decided which is the one that is to be recognized. Russia has also appealed its ban from the IOC, but unsurprisingly, it's been rejected. And that was, I think, quite recent. And then India went and got suspended in 2012. This was, again, push and pull government, our own NSFs trying to resist any kind of change, including the tenure and age restrictions that were not only being imposed by our government, but also by the IOC. So they got suspended. For the Sochi Olympics, our team went under the Olympic flag. They didn't go under the Indian flag. But midway through the Olympics, and this has never happened in history, they lifted the ban. So by the closing ceremony, they could carry the Indian flag. But the Russian athletes in Paris 2024 will compete under the IOC flag. They're not allowed to compete under the Russian flag. And team sports are out for them. So you can only compete in team sports if your country is registered or recognized. Germany and Japan were banned in 1948 after World War II. They were also banned in World War I. Germany was. And then Kuwait got banned in the middle of things. There's been a call to ban Israel, which realistically is probably not going to happen, but people have raised it to say that if you could ban Russia, is it different, what they're doing now? But that's been up for debate, and I think Thomas Bach actually said this is not even a question, so that's going to lie where it is. Now we come to cricket. So why is BCCI completely outside this purview? I mean, BCCI has never been part of the Olympic movement. The cricket was there earlier. It's returning to the Olympics in LA 2028. Now these are hugely there are many factors that go in on what games get included. But typically you may ask, like, break dancing has been included in the Paris Olympics first time. So the host country gets to choose some, the host country's committee gets to choose some games, and some get added, so those are temporary, and some get added permanently when the IOC meets. So cricket has been added, T20 cricket, which was a very big win for India. And so now the ICC for the first time has had to become a member of the IOC. So there will be some changes. This has happened recently. They need to become a member now so that they can actually host an event. They're going to host the cricket vertical. And they have never actually applied, BCCI never applied to become a national sports federation in India. So they were completely outside its purview. They were able to run their own vertical. There's a lot of economic muscle there, so they don't really need any funds or facilities from the government. They can afford everything they need to do on their own. But despite that, there was one case that did go to the Supreme Court on BCCI. There have been several actually, but one very big one where, because they weren't imposing the tenure and all the restrictions that were considered good governance, the Supreme Court actually said, okay, fine, we're going to start again from scratch. And they actually, under a retired Supreme Court judge, made a committee of administrators, and they started to actually run cricket for a short amount of time, until they were able to hand it over to an elected body. So now we're back to having an elected body in BCCI. They are probably going to have to become an NSF eventually, now that it is an Olympic sport, but they've been resisting that. They did make one big concession recently and say, okay, we will be part of the RTI, so we will give all our information out. But that was about it. So now, I mean, the biggest question that comes in all of this is very peculiar and unique to sport the way any of this is run. No business, no industry, nobody really functions like this. And it's a peculiarity of sport. And then the question is, basically you have a monopoly. You have one person running the sport to the exclusion of all others who may want to run a sport or participate in governance of a sport. And so I'm going to hand it over to Dia, who's actually going to take you through how the structures of sport meet the test of competition law. Can you really, is it really legal to be like this?
No, sorry, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to stand. I'm a litigator, so I'm used to standing when I speak. Okay, first, a few questions for all of you. How many of you play sport? Hands up. How many of you have played competitive sport? Okay, we've got quite a few people on competitive sport. So I'm going to put you guys a little bit on the spot over here. Anybody, put your hand up if you want to answer the question. What do you think is the role of a national sports federation in regulating sport? Do you think what they do is good or bad? Anybody? Good. How many people think it's good to have a national sports federation? You've heard Shayal for a long time. One person thinks it's good. How many people think it's bad to have a national sports federation? 2 people think it's bad, and the rest of you don't. You think bad or good? Bad. Okay, why bad?
Most of the time they tend to get corrupt, and it affects the youth, and it destroys sports.
Good answer. That has been a big problem in India, corruption, right, in these bodies. Now, why, when you say corruption, why do you think corruption happens? There's a lot of money to be made, right? There's a lot of power to be had. Whether it's cricket, whether it's football, there's sponsor money, there's, you're controlling players, you're controlling sponsorships. So they can become corrupt. Now let's assume they're not corrupt, right? Even if they're not corrupt, what are the other kinds of problems you think a sports body can come up with? Nepotism and favoritism. Good. Anything else? Okay, now let's take IPL as an example. Do all of you watch cricket? Yeah? Is there anything wrong in having a second IPL? You got IPL on the one hand. Let's say you were to have another league for cricket. Anything wrong with that? Yes? Who's saying yes? Why?
The schedule is congested enough as it is.
The schedule is congested. Good. Yeah?
No, that's it.
Also, schedule is congested. Now let's... Sorry.
I think IPL over time has also become a platform for selection of higher levels, let's say to the national team. Having another league will just become problematic in terms of prioritizing one league over the other in terms of whom to select. So that again is a problem.
Now let's take another sport like Kho-Kho, okay? Or can somebody come up, even Kho-Kho still has something. Baseball in India, right? Is there anything wrong in having a baseball league in India? Yes? Who's saying yes? Why?
Viewership, we don't know the sport.
Well, it might develop, right?
We
It
don't
might
need an extra headache.
Okay, what about
Just say.
a swimming league?
Maybe.
We don't have a swimming league, right? So you could have a swimming league. What about, I mean, anybody come up with some sport which we don't have a league for? Archery, Formula One. Let's talk about chess for a minute.
Dreams, bro, dreams.
Yes, you have a view on Formula One.
Continue sleeping.
Correct.
Let's see
Now, is there anything wrong in having another one?
So basically, the thing is, what is the point of having a racing league? Like the reason why all these youngsters go to race is because so that at one stage they will represent a team in Formula One. And like right now, the teams like the Mumbai Falcons are being recognized by F4, which is part of the FIA. And if you're forming another league which is not part of an FIA or another tournament which is not part of the FIA, what is the point of them going and racing there?
Absolutely right. Spot on. Now, why should the FIA not recognize another league? Why should they only recognize the Mumbai Falcon League? Why should they not recognize a second one?
So they have their own structures like the F4, F3, F2, and F1. And there's also several leagues like the WRC which are part of it. And the problem here right now is it's like the same thing. You can draw parallels to the problem cricket is facing right now. And like there are different levels and which are directly monitored by the FIA so that they make sure like there is no let's just say illegal things happen in other leagues. So they try to maintain transparency and they feel that the more control they have, the more regulated it is. And given that they have a set of norms and standards that they've laid out, it's easier for them to maintain quality of, let's say, tracks. So even the F1
Right.
tracks are graded in certain manners, like the Buddha International Circuit in Delhi and Noida is, I think, A grade A, yeah. So there are different tracks like that. So they have their own, factors that affect why certain things must be part of FIA and certain things are not.
Also, to add to that, you need to make sure the drivers are qualified as well,
Correct.
because otherwise it might
Why
be.
not, like, for example, in IPL, you start a relegation system and you relegate teams like RCB and then, you add
No, good point. Good point. Absolutely good point. Now, how many of you follow golf over here? Nobody. PGA Tour. Okay. We have two people following golf. Do you know that golf has the PGA Tour, the European Tour, the Asian Tour, the Australian Tour? They have, sorry, go ahead. We're coming to that. So, Live Golf has thrown a little spanner into the way golf worked always. Unlike the pyramid structure that Chal showed you for all sports, golf had an interesting mix where you actually had many leagues all over the world and people could choose where they wanted to go. You were not committed to just one stream, right? And why I'm bringing this up is because I want you to, all of you have said why we need this pyramid structure, right? Now I want you to think about what can go wrong. We had some points raised over here about corruption, about nepotism. When you don't have a system of plenty, right? The way our entire economy is structured in general, leave sports aside for a minute, what have we generally thought about? We've thought about what creates the best competition, right? What creates the best students? Competition. What creates the best economy? Competition, right? There's always been a need to say that let's have more instead of having just one. When we had, I mean, all of you are very young, but pre-1991, India did not have a lot of industries that competed with each other. We had a national, a lot of industries were nationalized. And in fact, even before 1991, we went through our era of socialism. You had the world go through the era of socialism, communism, where everything was nationalized, it was in one place. And that threw up a lot of issues saying that, look, if you don't have people competing with each other, what you're creating is a monster. You can create a monster, right? So what happens when this sports federation becomes a monster? And they say, for no good reason at all, I am banning you. Nepotism, right? I'm banning you for 10 years. You spoke badly to the coach, for example, therefore you are banned. They have a code of conduct which says, if you don't train 40 hours a day, you will not be allowed to compete in the next tournament. Now tell me any regulations that you can think of that can be bad for players that a federation may make. Anybody?
Bone density test.
A bone density test in cricket, okay. What else? Anything? Morality clauses, very good. Anything else? Yeah?
There's a thing in European football where if your country calls you up to play for them, you have no choice but to go. So sometimes what happens is players play a lot of matches for their clubs, and even though they're very fatigued and on the risk of injury, if your national team calls you, you have to go. You have no other choice.
Yeah.
So that's negative.
Mom, when we look at clubs like this and competitions at a smaller level, in a domestic level, when there are leagues going on by a small committee, we can see more traditional forms of regulations there. For example, racism being practiced, because racism was practiced till 1980s in Augusta International, like one of the top goal spot, let's say.
Yeah.
So more conservative, they don't have a modern approach, etc.
Yeah. And I mean, just while we're back on the subject of golf, right? Why is it that me as a player cannot choose my own schedule, right? I mean, you guys all brought up the issue of saying, look, the IPL is already, the schedule is so packed. Now, that's a team sport, but let's take any other individual sport, right? Or even other team sports. Or let's take chess as an example. Now, if the schedule's packed, it's packed. I want to take chess first as an example, right? If, let's say, you had 10 different chess leagues in this country, is there a problem with that? Anybody? Yes? Why? But you can choose your own schedule, right? You as a player can choose to decide that there are 10 competitions in the year. I will choose to participate in 2, 3, 4, and not all 10, right?
Other than the schedule, won't it just decrease the value of having a league in the first place? Like, there's IPL, right? If you have another league, what's the point of having IPL as the main league? There won't be any
Okay.
merit to being a IPL player.
There you go. So now it's decreasing the value of IPL, but perhaps it's creating opportunity for many more players, right? If you have only one league today, and look at cricket as a sport and the number of people playing that sport, right? Wouldn't it be nice to actually have and give an opportunity for so many others to play? IPL may still be the league of choice, and I'll come back to golf. PGA Tour is still the place they all want to reach because it's considered the best. But at least the other players have the opportunity to play the European, why can you not have multiple opportunities? Is there anything wrong with that, right? Funding can be a problem. It depends where you're getting the funding from. Now, let's say I today say, sorry, go ahead.
You have leagues below the IPL as well, right? So you get opportunities there. IPL is the only league at its level.
Correct.
So having parallel leagues would just make it a competition of who can offer more money and who can't.
And
So
what's wrong with
ultimately,
that from a player's point of view?
There'll still be lopsided. There'll be bias towards the IPL because it can offer more money. Hence, more better players will play in the IPL, and the other
what's
league
wrong
will
with
fade
that?
into irrelevancy.
What's wrong with that? There can be a lesser league. No?
The league will be forgotten, Mom. By time, it's gonna be a
I'm saying look at it from, there are 3 or 4 perspectives in which you're going to look at anything when you're evaluating it, right? It's the player's perspective, it's the commercial perspective, it's the spectator's perspective, and it's the federation's perspective, right? When you're looking at all these perspectives, sorry, there's a hand back.
And it was something like 4 days back and came back to your campus. So I am one of the professor in IT sports law. So you have to think for the other side of the IPL also. So when IPL has been started, before 3 years before that, there was a league which has been there. They just changed that league. They mentioned one thing. They mentioned that if you are playing this league, you are not going to play any state division league. You will not be played for the Indian team also. Forget Indian team, we are not participating in Irani. And then in IPL you have...
Can I just pause for a minute there? Thank you so much for that. Now, was there something wrong with that? Do they? And why should they be strong and why should they have monopolies? So I want to come back to the point that was raised over here, which is that if you have a restriction which says, if you participate in any other league, you will be banned and you will not be eligible for the India team. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that ugly? Is that something that should not be permitted?
Ma'am, sorry, once again. Then you need to consider another thing. If you are playing IPL, then you are going for Big Bash and other private leagues. You need to take off your jersey and put it in the Almeida because then you are never going to play for BCCI. I mean India team, right? So that is another side, and this is where I believe like they are creating the monopoly, and it is something like they are creating which is a hostile monopoly for the players, right? You need to consider that side also.
Thank you.
Don't we think we need some sort of order? If a player can just walk in, if a student can just walk in out of this class, there wouldn't be order here.
Okay, there was a hand here.
So let us walk in out of class.
I was remembering how Kapil Dev and others were reviewed by BCCI before the start of IPL for trying to bring Indian cricket league.
Yes, ICL, which came before IPL, right? And this is exactly the point that was made there, which was that this BCCI has a monopoly, and the question that arises is, are you abusing your monopoly? So there are two ways in which this could be checked, right? We have the Competition Act, and I'll come to explaining to you what the Competition Act is. And there is also perhaps a writ petition in the court, right? How many of you guys have done constitutional law yet? Admin law? Only one, okay. So then let me step back and explain to you the concept first of a writ petition and the concept of competition law, and then I'll come to explain to how we check this, right? We have come to the conclusion that perhaps sometimes when you have this monster can behave badly, right? It has the capacity to behave badly. It has the capacity to say, I'm sorry, but if you do X, I will not let you do Y, because I control you. I control whether you will represent India or not. And as a sportsman, that is the most important thing, to be part of the national team. Everything else is just practice, right? So if you're being banned from playing another league, which is practice for you, if you're being banned from participating or playing for India, those things are bad. And why should anybody be given the power to do that? So the test is there a legitimate reason? And a lot of you in your earlier interactions came up with legitimate reasons, right? If you're playing for the India team, you can't be tired. You cannot be playing 300 days of cricket and then play the India World Cup, because you will not be your fittest. So if you are part of the India team, I, as the BCCI, have the right to tell you that I'm sorry, but you cannot play for more than 200 days of the year. But do I have the right to tell you where you can play? Do I? I don't know, right? Do I have the right to say I will ban you? Or do I have the right to say I will ban an ICL and I will only permit an IPL? So these are questions that the court tests. It tests one and has tested under the Competition Act. What is the Competition Act? The Competition Act was a legislation which has nothing to do with sport. It came up in the context of, and it's there, it's called the antitrust legislation in the US, it's the EU Competition Act, and we have a Competition Act here, which says that we must promote competition. Everything that must be done is to promote competition. And whenever there is a monopoly in the market, is a monopoly bad? It may not be, but if the monopoly abuses its dominant position, that is the test, an abuse of dominance, then, I'll come to you in a minute. If they abuse their dominance, that is something they cannot do. Now, what is an abuse of dominance, right? And the test that has been brought out by the court is the ban or is the restriction legitimately related and proportionally related to the goal that they want to achieve? What is the goal of a national federation? The goal of a national federation is and ought to be to regulate the sport for the best interests of the players, right? And to produce the best team. Will you look and see whether it is relatable or not? Sorry, are we out of time? No. Okay. Okay. So that is the test. And that will be the same test that a constitutional court will also apply. Because these national federations, because they get funding from the government, are arguably what we call state under Article 12 of the Constitution. So they are bound not to act arbitrarily. They're bound to act reasonably. What is the test of arbitrary and reasonable? It's the same test. It has to be proportional and legitimate to the goals that you want to achieve. And it has to be the narrowest possible. So if you want to achieve the goal of, I need my cricketers rested for the World Cup, what is the narrowest way in which you can achieve that goal? To say, look, you can only play outside of the national, you cannot play during training, right? This is when the camp is going to be for the World Cup. You cannot play any events during that time. You cannot play for 300 days of the year because we need our players rested. Those would be legitimate, rational, proportional regulations. When this matter went to the Competition Commission, it's come up in several, where do we have the slides? Okay, so we have had 3 different cases. Dhanraj Pillai was the first one, which looked at EU competition law and said that competition law applies to sport, and federations are equally governed by the provisions on abuse of dominance and abuse of monopoly. In this particular case, what had happened was there was the India Hockey Federation, which came up with a new sports league. And Hockey India said, sorry, buddy, we're not recognizing your league. And if you play in an unsanctioned event, as per the rules of FIH, an unsanctioned event means you will be banned, right? So what does the Competition Commission do when they look at this? On facts, they hold that actually Indian Hockey Federation ought to have sought a sanction from the National Federation. They didn't seek a sanction. Therefore, although Hockey India is in a position of abusing its dominance, in the facts, we find they've not abused their dominance. Chess, on the other hand, was interesting because in chess, they had banned players from competing in another league. They had said, we're not going to sanction another league. And if you participate, we will take away all your prize money and ban you for X number of years. So the Competition Commission says, sorry, this is disproportionate. You cannot, and chess is very different from any other sport. You don't need to be rested. You don't need to protect your players' physical health. They can decide which leagues they want to play in. And then the BCCI case it had nothing to do with players, but it was on the issue of broadcasting, because BCCI makes a lot of money with broadcasting rights, right? So they had said that there was a 10-year limit on saying that broadcasting rights cannot be given to anybody else for 10 years, and the Competition Commission said that this is an abuse of dominance. So this is where the Competition Commission has looked at abuses of dominance and said that you cannot abuse your dominant position. Now I'll come back to the person who had their hand up over there for the longest time. Sorry, I said I'll come back to you.
My point was that all of the policies of the BCCI has enabled it to become a superpower in the cricketing world. So as of this moment, ICC is at the mercy of BCCI, which is beneficial for us, right?
And that's why I said there's no problem in creating the monster, right? The problem is when the monster makes regulations which are what we call an abuse of dominance. It's great, you're right. It's great that we have a BCCI. So that's why the Competition Act even doesn't say, let's not create giant enterprises. I mean, if you see the way the world has gone, we have several giant enterprises today, right? Competition law the world over doesn't control the creation. There is merger control, and I'll come to that separately. But effectively, nobody's saying don't become too big, right? Don't become too powerful. They're just saying don't abuse your power, right? And that is, in some sense, fundamental to everything, right? To anybody that holds power. That's what the Constitution does. That's what administrative law does. That's what every law that we study does. It says never abuse power, right? And what sports has done is, because it's created this pyramid structure, the regulation has enabled the creation of power, right? Everybody else has to jostle. They have to compete, right? You compete, and then in that competition, you may emerge as the Apple of the world, or you may emerge as the Amazon of the world, but you've competed to get there, right? Here, state has handed it to you on a platter and said, yes, you are the guy that gets to be all-powerful, right? And then there has to be some check on that power. So what you all need to think about is when any sports federation is abusing that power, and it can abuse it in a myriad of ways, right? Look at it from the perspective of competition, look at it in the perspective of the player, right? Are they abusing their power qua the player? Are they abusing their power qua the market, right? That they're actually not allowing access of the market to any other players, right? They're not allowing other leagues to develop. And if they're not allowing other leagues to develop, is there a rational reason for them not to allow it? That is for the good of the sport, not for their power, right? That's the test. And that's the test that you will apply when you apply competition law. That's the test that you will apply even if you were to file a writ petition in court, right? The court will also look at, was that arbitrary abuse of power, right? Is what they're doing right? Is it rational? Is it proportionate? Is it legitimate? So that's the sort of broad structure of competition law and competition governance. Questions? So I'll just go through, we've been through all of this. Sorry, go ahead.
So during my internship, I actually dealt with sports law and national sports federations quite a bit, and I ran across a case where there was overlap between national sports federation, namely the CPSFI, the Cerebral Palsy Sports Federation, and the Paralympic Committee, and there were multiple cases of conflict in selection of players. So what happens if two national sports federations have conflicting interests and overlapping goals?
When you see two national sports federations in two different sports.
This is a very interesting case. So Paralympic Committee of India is an NSF that is responsible for sending players Paralympics. There is another committee called the Cerebral Palsy Sports Federation of India, which is also an NSF. So there was an overlapping of the Paralympic cerebral palsy athletes and the general Paralympic athletes, and there was a lot of conflict between who gets power, the PCI or the other sports committee.
I'll let Shahil take that.
So the first question one would ask in this situation would be, which of these two associations is affiliated to the Indian Olympic Association?
The Paralympic Committee of India.
So the Paralympic Committee therefore is tasked with fielding the team to wherever they're going, whether it's the Paralympics or whatever, because again, you have to go through the pyramid. So who has the membership? So if it's the you'll ask two questions in any of these conversations when there are competing sports federations. Who is affiliated to its international federation? Who is affiliated to the Indian Olympic Association? The third question you will ask is, who is affiliated, which international federation is affiliated to the IOC. So sometimes what will happen, and this happened in bodybuilding in India, where there were multiple bodybuilding federations, there were also multiple international bodybuilding federations. And because they did not have none of them had international recognition, it was very unclear to everybody in the system on who would be the right. But for your particular case, so these are the questions to ask. The IF, the NOC, are they a member of those two? If there are multiple IFs, which IF is the member of the IOC? So in the case that you were doing, the simple answer would be, as per the Olympic Charter, that it's the Paralympic NSF that would be fielding the team. Therefore, they are in charge of selections.
Understood. Thank you.
So I think it's a question that's pure importance and dominance in the sport. The reason why BCCI has able to become this dominant in the sport is not out by rejigging the rules and regulations. They are still just one NSF, a part of the ICC, but they control the maximum eyeballs that watch cricket. That's just the sheer might of money and muscle in broadcasting rights, and how many people in India watch cricket, and how much money they are able to bring into the sport of cricket is what's given them this dominant position in the world. And dehors that dominance, which is the money power that they are just able to galvanize, they probably wouldn't have that. They didn't have that in the 80s. I mean, when you think about when India went to the World Cup, won their first the World Cup, I mean, they were not a dominant cricket organization. BCCI now rules the roost. So, you know, I mean, they've had their own journey, but it's pure might and muscle. But also coming back to, you know, there's an interesting point there on RTI, and this is currently in court in a case I'm doing, on asking about the surrogate advertising. And if you're asking for any of their private deals, under the RTI Act, there's a provision for matters of commercial confidence. And the question that is yet pending before a court is NSFs, National Sports Federations, actually enter into private sponsorship agreements because they need sponsors for the team, the players. They sell broadcasting rights, they sell various things. And should they have to disclose that to the public in an RTI or not? So some of them have resisted to say, look, that affects our negotiations when we have to bring the next round of sponsors in. If everyone knows what X paid, how do I ask for more from Y? And they don't necessarily want to do that. So that question is actually still pending on the extent, while they're all under RTI, the extent of how much information they will divulge is interesting.
And sorry, just to also come back to a less idealistic version of this pyramid, when you asked the question about BCCI and ICC, I mean, it's all about power, right? You will see any international federation. The question is who grabs the power in that international federation. Usually it will always be some country that dominates in that sport because they have, you know, the muscle. So whether you see football, whether you see cricket, whether you see the IOC, it is a fight for power. You know, these are not some holier than thou, we love sport organizations. It is the way humanity functions across the board in every sphere. It's political, it's a jostle for power, and BCCI or India has currently won that jostle for power in controlling the ICC. So that's the other perspective.
So I think you touched upon this. That sports person can head state sports association. So and like in contrast there is a rule. In contrast there is a rule for sports the autonomy of sporting federations to have and their own rule. And excessive state control can lead to their suspension.
Right.
So what do you think? Is there excessive judicial activism happening in India and compared to law?
So look, you know, the pendulum always swings. When we hosted the CWG, there was a huge public outroar, and cases were started, officials were prosecuted. You know, whenever there is room for improvement, certainly in the administration of sports in India, I think everyone is at item on that. There is no doubt about that. So the idea that there is activism in it where the courts get involved, I think the courts find room to get involved because nobody else has actually been able to, there's a vacuum of somebody being able to clean up a system that needs some cleaning. And so the courts have sort of come about in the absence of a very clear legislation, the sports code becoming enforceable, the sports code having certain important things like breaking the tenures, having an age restriction, just to having a certain number of sports people as your voting body, participating in elections for the people who are governing them. Now, there is certainly room for all of these improvements. So when these improvements happen, whether they happen through legislation or they happen through somebody saying that, look, there is some guidelines that could be binding. So I think activism in all judicial forms it's always a fine line. When does the court go too far? Has it gone beyond the scope of what its actual jurisdiction is? And when courts look at sports matters, sometimes they look at it from a very, very public interest perspective, which is that, why are athletes, you'll see a newspaper article of terrible conditions for athletes in a particular training camp, or they didn't get a certain facility, which certainly should have been provided. So these are all things which I think courts, because they are state, it gives the court room to interfere because they get money from the government, and they are also amenable to writ jurisdiction. And when you're amenable to a writ jurisdiction, you are answerable.
Hi, thank you, ma'am. Right here at the back. So, in terms of this pyramid right here, I just had a few doubts. I was a bit grey on the understanding, because it says that the international federations fall under the below per se the National Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee also. Now, in cases such as football, right, where we have powerful international federations such as FIFA, who are the governing authorities, would this pyramid still hold true in those cases, considering that no National Olympic Committee would ever think of even dictating? As a matter of fact, in reality, the International Olympic Committee listens to FIFA more than the other way around.
It's a very good question. This pyramid, its format has completely changed on this, the way it's been displayed. It was actually a 3D pyramid that had the NOCs and IFs together in the same as members of the IOC. So your question is absolutely right. The IFs do not fall below the NOCs. NOCs plus IFs form the membership of the IOC. So that's the way all of you should read it, because this is sort of, I think I must have used a different software, and therefore it's not displayed properly. But as far as, so that answers your question. They are both, the IFs and the NOCs are both members of the IOC. They operate in different verticals. The IFs are only answerable to the IOC and nobody else. The NOCs are separately answerable to the IOCs. They are not answerable to the IFs either. So they are parallel bodies, and then the NSFs have to be members of both. So if you see the slide that came after that, this one, so this kind of explains, so you have the IFs on one side and the NOCs on the other, and then an NSF actually has to have dual affiliation.
I just have a follow-up question on this also. Can we say that the National Olympic Committees are affiliated to IOC, or are they representative of the IOC? Because from what I have learned particularly, and I might be wrong, so I'm seeking clarification, is that the Olympic committees for each nation, it is not appointed by the country particularly, it is representative of the International Olympic Committee more than the representative of the nation, right? In the sense that it is governed directly, dictated to by the IOC. Whereas other national federations have sort of an autonomy in other sports, the Olympic committees, National Olympic Committees are representative of the IOC instead of the country more.
So the IOA, for example, is, and that's a good question. So yes, the NOC or the IOA is the representative of the IOC in India, meaning they are their member. So you have to be a member of the IOC to be your NOC. So the Indian Olympic Association is a member of the IOC. At the same time, in the next case, where you'll see the next slide, in the Rahul Mehra case, it has been held that the IOA also has to abide by the sports code. So while as per what IOC mandates, they must be as per the Olympic Charter. In India, as the law is developed, they also have to be compliant with the National Sports Code. If you actually read the National Sports Code, it's designed for NSFs. It talks about national sports federations. The way it's designed is all for national sports federations, which is why the IOA actually argued in these cases that it's not built for me, because the way it's structured doesn't work for an NOC, it works for an NSF. Court rejected that and said, no, that's fine. You're going to follow the same rules. So they have a dual kind of situation here where they have to be compliant with the Olympic Charter and with, as per the decision, also the National Sports Code.
Ma'am, I also had a question regarding the previous conversation about the dominance of the BCCI, which was under view, if I may, and if I'm not taking time away from anybody else. In terms of, we all know at the end of the day, it all comes down to money, right? In any world politics, any sporting body in the world. My issue is I fail to see why the dominance of the BCCI per se, I'm not talking about the Indian players allowed to play in other leagues or not, in terms of dictating world cricket, right? Any other sport we see, there are particular countries which dictate the sport. In football, we see England and the other European countries. Their leagues are always kept up high. The Premier League is always commercially viable, which is why it's always, England player so much so that they do not even players from teams post rank 50 are not allowed to play in the Premier League. Even they have restrictions. So what I want to say is that I fail to see why it particularly is a bad thing for the BCCI to monopolize cricket.
It's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. Nobody's saying it's a bad thing at all. And that's why we said that the issue is not, and I think we've all recognized, even by all of your own discussion, that it is important to have one federation. The pyramid structure is important for a variety of reasons, right? It's important because it controls the schedule, it controls the calendar, it gives you sanctioned events, it creates a pathway, it creates a structure. There are many reasons why it's important to have it. And it's also important to have the international federation, right? Nobody's saying it's a bad thing. What we're saying is that when there is anybody in power, right, and they abuse the power, there needs to be some remedy for that, right? And the court has found remedy in competition law on that. But in terms of BCCI controlling ICC, you're quite right. And I mean, that was exactly the point we made a few minutes ago, which is that because they control cricket, and India is a cricketing nation, they get to control the international body of cricket. Europe gets to control the international body of football. Premier League is very popular. IPL is very popular, right? So it is whichever, and baseball in the US, basketball in the US. So wherever a sport is popular, that country, just by virtue of, the commercials, the number of people, everything, will control that sport internationally. And that's just, there's nothing good or bad with it. It's just the way it is. Okay, so I think that before we end this class, I want everybody to very quickly answer this question. If you had to change something in the sporting world, the world of sporting governance, what would it be? Rapid fire answers. Anybody? Yeah.
National Sports Code. It needs to be made better. It's very haphazard right now.
Okay. Anybody else? Nepotism. Sorry? Nepotism is very bad, yes, we know. And not just in sport, yes.
More transparency, especially in its financial aspects, the financials it's getting, especially from the state government, central government.
Financial transparency. Sorry? Political interference.
Just recently, in 2022 only, or 2021, WFI was banned because of the rape allegation.
Correct, correct. Yes, absolutely. Very, very, very good example. Yes, this is the end of the class. Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an enlightening and enriching session.
Hello, check.
Thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful class.
Check.